We could have sold out this hall 10 times. 10 times. We've already sold it out 3 times.
I think it's very fitting, by the way, I see some signs up there and I appreciate them, Free Julian Assange, and I echo that sentiment. And I think it's very telling, and I think we should all meditate on this, how just as Julian Assange had to find asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, we had to find asylum at the Venezuelan Cultural Center. And I want to thank the government of Venezuela for allowing us to be here. And despite the fact that our countries, the United States and Great Britain, try to tell the world how to be democratic and how to have free speech and free rights, we have to go to a Venezuelan building to hold this event. Because no one else will house it. Not even buildings, as I was told before here, that used to house heretics and protect them, and they will not house us. Despite the fact that what we were saying is true. But of course, as Dostoevsky wrote many years ago, it's easier to forgive someone for being wrong than to forgive them for being right.
And who is the man presiding over this authoritarianism, over this stifling and gagging of anyone who dares to put forward a nuanced debate on what this war or any war is about? Starmer. And I'm really proud that me and the Merseyside pensioners caught Starmer scurrying round in a little cafe. If you haven't seen it, 3 million other people have seen it. We are now living in a one-party state. Absolutely. We're living in much scarier and authoritarian times than when we was trying to stop the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. But I'd say to everyone here, the anti-war movement has the power to shine a light towards peace. It always had. And this is why this event is so important, and I hope there's more of them.
How are you doing, Audrey?
All right, just travelled up from Liverpool this morning, so yeah, it's good to be here.
And what I wanted to find out about was, I mean, you've just spoken and you got lots of applause and people standing up because you talked about Labour Party's policy on NATO and the censorship on it. I mean, can you tell us what you think about, for example, John McDonnell's statement that he did a blog, didn't he, an article about NATO saying that we needed to support the Ukrainian workers. What's your response to what he said there?
Well, I'm really disappointed in John's statement, to be honest with you, because, you know, he's being a real supporter of, or put it this way, in opposition to war. But on this particular question, to get into the argument that the best way to end war is to pour in more arms is absolutely, you know, dreadful. And if you support workers, you know, you have to support workers everywhere. And the working class of Europe is paying the cost of this war. The working class of Britain is paying the cost of this war. And so is the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people have been sent to the slaughter over this war. It's we can't say, you know, that history started when Russia invaded Ukraine. This war started in 2014. Let's not ignore history. Let's look at the facts. Let's take the blindfold off people and talk about what's really going on, why there is a war going on, why NATO is playing the role that it is, and the way the Labour Party is actually turning around and censoring even nuanced arguments. Anyone who says anything that isn't conforming with the status quo is absolutely trashed as a Putin sympathiser and absolutely silenced. And that's what the witch hunt has been about, to be honest with you, Crispin.
He's the leader of what is surely the hope of the people of the United States, though that's their business. The People's Party of America. He's the leader of Rage Against the War Machine in Washington, D.C. He is Nick Brannan, and he's here with us.
So I wanted to come and share what happened in the United States and its significance. A week ago, we brought 3,000 people out to the Lincoln Memorial, an iconic location where Dr. Martin Luther King and others have given their speeches against war and poverty, and they joined us there to rage against the war machine. We're tired of our hard-earned money going to these wars. $100 billion in the United States has been spent on top of an $850 billion annual military budget that grows every year, while programs to reduce poverty crash, while programs for food stamps crash, while homelessness explodes, and people are getting tired of it. Because it's $1 billion here, $2 billion there, tanks over here, Patriot weapon systems over there, one after the other in the news, while everybody sees that their own lives are becoming worse and worse, while all of our funds are being shipped over to Ukraine for these wars and risking a nuclear war that would annihilate all of us.
Are we on? Yeah, well, look, it's great. We've got Nick Brannan. He's come all the way from America, I mean, to come here to this event. See, Nick's been on the show a couple of times. Nick, that's a long journey to make. Why did you want to come to this No to NATO, No to War event?
Because our countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, are the ones that are primarily responsible for this war. They're the ones that are primarily responsible for the hegemony stretching back to the Second World War and then beyond. You know, 100 years before that, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And so the way I see it, we have the greatest responsibility to redress those crimes that we've committed and to end it for once and for all, the people in our countries. And so that's why I'm thrilled to see people rising up in the UK, in the US, with the Rage Against the War Machine protests we had, with No to NATO, and there being this rising opposition to the war machine, to the empire that we have perpetuated and perpetrated on the world for hundreds of years now.
Let me just say a word from Dennis Kucinich, who's a former congressman, and he just has given me a statement that he'd like me to read out to you today. So let me just do that before I get into my speech. He said this: "As you gather today in London, know there are many Americans who are cheering on your efforts to awaken the United Kingdom to the disaster which awaits everyone should NATO members continue to choose escalation over diplomacy in dealing with Russia. The war in Ukraine should have never happened. Western leaders have used the brave men and women of Ukraine as pawns in an international power play to isolate Russia and destroy its energy resources. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines under the orders of President Biden, as reported by Seymour Hersh, is a grim reminder of how the domestic security of the German people in winter was cynically sacrificed to the callous designs of global domination by ideologues. Let us stand together for the security of our nations and the world, for an end to the war in Ukraine, for an end to the danger of nuclear war, and for a new beginning, assuring human and ecological security under the banner of strength through peace." Thank you, Dennis. I want to say a word or two about someone who should be celebrated, but who most people have never heard of. I'm talking about Smedley Butler, who retired from the US military in 1931. He'd been a general in the US Marine Corps and was a loyal servant of US imperialism. He joined the Marines as an idealistic 16-year-old and spent much of his military career thinking he was engaged in a noble endeavour. But the light of experience changed him. He came to the awful realisation that his military career wasn't in the service of a noble cause after all. He recognised that he was simply serving the profit motive of big business. And after he retired, he didn't pull any punches about the real motive for war. He said he'd spent most of his life, and I quote, as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. And he added, in short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. In 1935, he also published a book entitled War is a Racket, which in my opinion should be taught in every school in the land. He said it's the only racket in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. Now that was 88 years ago, but rather than heed Butler's words, political leaders, including Labour Party leaders, have made the situation considerably worse. In the modern world, it's NATO that acts as a muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. And the Labour Party is one of NATO's biggest cheerleaders. Yet those of us who campaign for peace and oppose war are smeared and demonised by NATO's liberal lackeys and the corporate media, which does the war machine's bidding. But we cannot let the war machine and its toadying trolls and sycophantic media hacks prevail. These trolls pulled out all the stops to get this event cancelled today, including a campaign of intimidation against two of the previous venues who'd accepted our booking. Yet here we are, making a stand for peace and humanity. And we can only go from strength to strength, in my opinion, because people are increasingly coming to the realisation that what we're demanding is plain common sense. But all the political class on both sides of the Atlantic are enthralled to NATO. They're addicted to war, so they use public money to acquire more and more weapons.
Let's look at the defence spending increases. A 1% increase in defence spending by 2030, but that equates to £157 billion of taxpayers' money going into the war machine. And that's on top of, by the way, a £17 billion increase during COVID, which not many people know about. Now, we're in dispute. We've had no pay for 3 years, and I know you're not going to cry into your shirt sleeves about train drivers just yet, but there are other workers who are so poorly paid that they have to go to food banks, and obviously the nurses are a good cause there. But that £157 billion, I would argue, would go a long way to ending that industrial unrest. And if they gave the nurses a 10% pay rise, this would only cost, I know it's a big number, but only cost £23 billion. So I know where my money would rather go. There are far more pressing things in this country that we need to spend our money more on than killing people.
The Pentagon issued a warning to China 3 days ago, before President Xi's peace proposals, when they didn't know what was in the peace proposals. There will be consequences for China should it decide to deepen its relations with Russia. Think of the arrogance, first of all, of that. We'll come to the stupidity. But think of the arrogance of one superpower threatening a second superpower with consequences were it to decide to have more friendly relations with a third party. The sense of exceptionalism you must feel to think you're entitled to do that, to think you're entitled to warn other countries who they can be friends with. But let's turn to the stupidity of it. You know, from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger onwards, it was the policy of the United States to keep Russia and China as far apart as it was possible to keep them, and if possible, to keep them at each other's throats. In the last few years, the policy of the United States and NATO has made Russia and China virtually one country, certainly militarily and economically one country. And now they think China is going to obey orders from somebody called Antony Blinken. The days when China could be ordered around by foreigners is over, 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 over. Ditto South Africa. South Africa was warned, why are you having joint naval exercises with the Russian and Chinese navies? As the leadership in South Africa pointed out, when you Western colonialist countries were supporting the apartheid dictatorship in South Africa, the only countries that stood with us were Russia and China. And you want us to consider them our enemies? I'm so old, I was there. Every dinner that the African National Congress fighters ate in the bush came from Russia. Every uniform they had, every gun that they carried, every international initiative, campaign that they were able to mount to bring about the freedom of South Africa came from the then Soviet Union and from China. And now you want South Africa to be an enemy of Russia and China? Are you crazy? And South Africa has said no. India has said no. Iran has said no. Latin America, from north to south, has said no. Asia has said no. The Arab worlds, even the Saudis and the kings and the sheikhs in the desert have said no. The world is not against Russia and China. Don't imagine you speak for the world. The West, if you include it in it, countries that are very definitely not in the West. The last time I looked at the globe, Australia is not in the West. New Zealand is not in the West. But even if you allow them to call themselves the West, is 13% of the people of the world. 13% of the world's population lives in what could loosely be described as the West. And we are here to say, even in the West, there are millions and millions and millions of us who reject your domination and your wars and your clubs.
This is about the US Cold War against China too. The Biden administration believes that if it succeeds in weakening Russia, a country that is very large and has serious military power, this will strengthen the US's ability to attack China in the future. So what we have at the moment is not only this escalating proxy war against Russia, but we've also got the Cold War against China, which is really heating up. I imagine most of you haven't been able to avoid this in recent weeks, but the Western media has been focused on hyping up the alleged threat posed by a solitary Chinese balloon that was blown off course into US airspace. There's been a furore about this over the balloon. It sparked a diplomatic crisis, and incredibly, the United States has deployed advanced, very expensive weapons to deal with this balloon. So I'm really sorry to say it, but this balloon crisis is quite simply hot air. Yay. Sorry, the jokes won't get better. They won't get better. But in all seriousness, this is a manufactured by the United States to whip up hostility to China within the United States and create an atmosphere of tension in the world. And Britain, of course, is joining in with this fast. We had our very own Prime Minister declaring it will do whatever it takes to keep the country safe from balloons so we can all sleep soundly. We've really got to understand that the US and its allies are attempting to prepare public opinion in the West for a possible hot war with China. I mean, how devastating would that be for humanity? And Washington, I mean, this is the news, balloons, 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 but what Washington's been doing in recent weeks is working with key allies in the Pacific region to escalate the military encirclement of China in preparation for a potential hot war in Asia. So instead of embarking on a policy of international cooperation to solve massive problems like climate change, the entire US political establishment is uniting around a very aggressive policy aimed at stopping the rise of China. So I just want to take a moment, the extraordinary economic, social, technological rise of China, bringing over 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years. I mean, the Western media say, but at what cost? But at what cost have you brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? Anything that China does, there's a negative spin on it. This rise of China, this peaceful rise of China, is regarded by elites in Washington as an existential threat to their global hegemony, and they are prepared to do whatever it takes to stop China, and they are contemplating methods which could endanger every single person on this planet.
He is one of Her Majesty's former ambassadors, in his case to Uzbekistan, from which lofty position he was dismissed by the Blair government and the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, for, and I quote, over-focusing on human rights. Something worth remembering when you hear them prattle about human rights today. And his presence here illustrates the point I made earlier, that this is the broadest possible movement, that you don't have to be left or right or centre, that you don't have to have agreed, all of us, with each other on all previous matters. You don't pass any ideological blood tests to be here. To be here, all you have to do is oppose NATO's war, saying no to NATO, no to war. Please welcome His Excellency, the Honourable Craig Murray.
One thing about George which annoys me most is he's teetotal. And there is a Russian saying, which is that you should never trust a man who doesn't drink, because he must be hiding something, which... These matters are complex. It is not a situation that you can look at and say, these are the goodies and these are the baddies, this is absolute right or wrong. You're looking at the working out of very complex historical shifts and antagonisms and fights for resources over centuries. But the one thing you can say for certain is that the answer to none of these questions is to kill people. War is never justified. My own view is that simply as a matter of international law, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was illegal. It was illegal in international law, as illegal as the British invasion of Iraq was illegal in international law. Was it provoked? Yes. Can we understand why it happened? Yes. Was it legal? No. But we are where we are. And the question is now, how do you stop? Now, we had been told throughout the Cold War that the Soviet Union was this massively powerful, frightening military power, and that we needed to spend huge amounts of public money on weapons systems and military and security services in order to defend ourselves against this massive military power. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and when Western experts, defense attaches and others were able to get in and actually visit the Russian army, the former Soviet army, they discovered that Russia had approximately 40% of the weapon systems that the intelligence had told us they had, and that those weapon systems were approximately half as effective as the intelligence had told us they had, because the threat of the Soviet Union was massively, massively exaggerated by Western intelligence in order to justify massive arms spending and the corruption and the money and the weapon and the job go down that goes with it. And that remains true to this day. I know a lot of people would love it if the West and Western imperialism and Western aggression were counterbalanced by an equal military force. But it isn't. Russian armed forces are not that strong. And the idea being sold through the media that the Russian army, which cannot take Kiev, could march through Kiev, through Warsaw, through Berlin, through Brussels, through Amsterdam, through Paris, and march through London is obvious bollocks. But that is the idea which we are sold to justify massive military expenditure. This is not a war with good guys and bad guys on either side. The people who control militaries, the people who control the weapons of death, the people who send ordinary young people to fight and die and who result in thousands and thousands of civilian casualties, they are not good people on either side. This war is evil.
What's happening in Ukraine is essentially the Russians defending themselves against NATO aggression. And, I think in that circumstance, we should be thinking about what we think is the appropriate thing for the peace movement to be doing. In particular, we're now moving into a period where the unipolar world we've known since the end of the Soviet Union is coming to an end, and it's very clear to everyone who pays attention that the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians and many others are getting together, and as a result of that, American power is going to dissolve, and we're seeing the birth pangs of a multipolar world in the conflict in Ukraine, and I think that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight, and that's one of the reasons I've come here to talk about it. The censorship we face now is of a much greater order than it was in 2003, for example. So in 2003, whenever it was the case that the government would put out a bit of propaganda, within days it would be debunked, and that debunking would eventually make its way to the mainstream media. Now, if you debunk government propaganda on Ukraine over alleged Russian massacres or whatever it is, on the Kerch Bridge or whatever, nobody in the mainstream pays any attention whatsoever. There's a total blanket of censorship, so it's almost impossible to get out simply truthful things about what's happening in Ukraine. If you do get truthful statements out, then you are derided and attacked by all these NGOs focusing their work on disinformation, the disinformation industrial complex. Now, all of these organisations, without any exceptions, are funded indirectly by Western governments. So we have a total blanket of censorship. My Twitter account is shadow banned, many other people's Twitter accounts are shadow banned. Mine also says Iran state-affiliated media because I run a show called Palestine Declassified, which is broadcast on Press TV. So there is a huge blanket of censorship, more than anything I've ever known in my adult life.
Okay, look, we're here with Low Key. It's just before the last session of the No to NATO, No to War rally. I just want to ask you, Low Key, what is it you think about this censorship of any anti-war voices? I mean, do you think that they've gone too far? Do you think there might be a counter to that?
The reality is that Britain, even as far back as World War I, has always sought to marginalise the anti-war voices in the world. We are round the corner from Russell Square, which is named after the family of Bertrand Russell. This was somebody who spent 6 months in prison because of his opposition to World War I. You saw people even sentenced to death during World War I for opposing the war and for refusing to kill. Some of those were excommunicated, and that was good. But we have also seen in the United States someone like Eugene Debs. Because he opposed World War I, he spent years in prison, and 1 million people voted for him to be president while he was in prison because of his opposition to World War I. In fact, you're seeing the legislation which was established at that time, the Espionage Act, to crush anti-war feeling in the US, be used against Julian Assange potentially by the US government. So in many ways, what we see today is a development on what took place before. In terms of the reality of the situation, Britain is the 5th largest economy in the world, and it is scheduled and promised to fall to the 11th largest economy in the world. That process will not be painless. The United States, of course, is the 1st largest economy in the world, and it's scheduled to fall below China. What Britain and the United States are making clear is that they will go out kicking and screaming. But actually, that is a return to a more natural economic equilibrium. We can't forget that when the East India Company was founded in the 1600s, Britain was a tiny percentage of the world's economy, whereas China and India were almost around 50% of the world's economy when taken together. What you saw through the hundreds of years of British colonialism and Britain occupying 14.7 million square miles of the planet was Britain seeking to deindustrialize the countries it occupied and actually wield the produce in those countries for the interests of Britain. People were kept as captive labor. They were also used as captive markets, and also the resources were used to enrich people in London. However, we do know that at that time, literally as recently as the late 1800s, the life expectancy, even in places like Bethnal Green, for people that worked in chimneys, was something like 16 years old. So what you actually saw was the elites of these countries able to enrich themselves. Now, what you've seen since the beginning of the neoliberal era was China take its place as the workshop of the world. Now, the natural consequence of that is that China is therefore the #1 trading partner of most of the large economies in the world, even countries that the United States is attempting to manipulate against the Chinese. Do you think people in the European Union don't know that the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Of course they do. People are aching for a different world, a fairer world, a more even world, a more just world. And this event and others like it are merely an expression of that yearning for a different world. So I say it doesn't matter how they attempt to censor us, as the book burners of the past have found. Whenever you suppress ideas, you make it harder to justify your own arguments against those ideas. And in fact, you reveal how synthetic your arguments against those ideas actually are, because you have had to resort to such tactics.
Can't say anything better than that. You put it in a nutshell. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Great. Great to see you. Thanks.